You know the voice, you know the hits, but do you know the man who built it all and then was left in the shadows? He discovered Teddy Pendergrass, nurtured a group that redefined soul music, and carried the sound of Philadelphia into living rooms across America. Yet, in the end, the very industry he helped shape turned its back on him. Harold Melvin, a visionary, a perfectionist, and one of soul's most overlooked architects. Born in North Philadelphia, he wasn't destined for stardom. There were no wealthy patrons or golden connections waiting to pull him onto the stage. What he had was something rarer, a voice filled with fire, and a mind obsessed with building something greater than himself. From the beginning, Harold wasn't satisfied with simply singing the notes. He wanted to conduct the symphony, to mold voices, to control the stage, to craft a sound that could last. And he did. Through sheer will, he transformed a group of neighborhood kids into the Blue Notes, a machine of harmony, discipline, and emotion. He put his name on the marquee not out of vanity, but to anchor the legacy he was determined to create. Without him, there would be no Teddy Pendergrass, no blueprint for Philadelphia soul. No songs like If You Don't Know Me By Now or Wake Up, everybody echoing through generations. Yet Harold Melvin died in near silence. No grand tributes, no glittering Lifetime Achievement Awards, barely a headline. How could the man who built the stage never be given his final bow? This is the untold story of Harold Melvin, the man behind the Blue Notes, the architect of a sound, and one of soul music's most underrated legends. The 25th of June, 1939, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In a city buzzing with rhythm yet burdened with poverty and segregation, a boy named Harold Melvin entered the world. North Philadelphia in the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds was a paradox. On one hand, it pulsed with jazz clubs, church choirs, and the first sparks of rhythm and blues. On the other, it was scarred by discrimination, unemployment, and the relentless weight of poverty that pressed down on African American families. For many young black kids, the paths were narrow and unforgiving. The church offered salvation, the streets offered danger, and the microphone offered possibility. From the start, Harold gravitated toward the microphone. He wasn't born into musical royalty. No famous mentors appeared to open doors for him. No industry connections waited to shepherd his career. All he had was a voice smooth, commanding, brimming with emotion, and an even rarer gift, vision. Even as a teenager, Harold didn't just dream of singing. He dreamed of organizing, building, and leading. He wasn't content to be another singer. He wanted to construct something larger, something lasting. By the early 1,950 seconds, Harold was barely 15 when he gathered a few neighborhood friends to form his first vocal group. They called themselves the Charlemagne. The name didn't stick. The group floundered, but Harold refused to let the dream slip away. By 1954, he rebranded the ensemble with a new name, one that carried a touch of elegance and ambition, the Blue Notes. From that moment forward, the young Harold became the de facto leader, arranger, manager, and motivator. At an age when most kids were still trying to figure out high school, Harold was already molding voices, writing harmonies, and setting rehearsal schedules. It was unusual, almost unheard of for a young black teenager in the 1,950 seconds to take on such control. But Harold wasn't like most. He studied the doo-wop pioneers of the day, groups like the Drifters and the Moonglows, analyzing their soaring harmonies and learning how to blend gospel roots with urbane sophistication. The Blue Notes weren't just trying to mimic. They were experimenting with something sharper, slicker, more emotionally raw. But vision didn't equal instant success. The early years were anything but glamorous. The Blue Notes hustled their way through the Philly club circuit, performing at talent shows, school dances, and anywhere they could find a microphone. Long nights were spent lugging cheap equipment, harmonizing in back rooms, and praying for a break. In 1956, they released their first single, If You Love Me, Really Love Me. It was supposed to be the moment that catapulted them into stardom. Instead, the record went nowhere. No national traction, just another forgotten 45 lost in the shuffle. It was a harsh lesson for Harold, but not one that broke him. Instead, it hardened him. The music industry of the 1,950 seconds was brutal, especially for young black artists with no label backing. Promoters promised gigs and disappeared. Managers skimmed off what little pay there was. Record executives dangled opportunities that rarely materialized. Many groups fell apart under the weight of disappointment. But Harold doubled down. Each setback sharpened his perfectionism. Each failure fueled his resolve. His leadership grew firmer, even uncompromising. Some who sang with him later remembered him as a drill sergeant, pushing members through grueling rehearsals, demanding that every harmony land with precision. Others called him a musical genius, able to hear textures and layers no one else could imagine. Whichever description you believed, one truth remained. Harold Melvin, when singers left, he replaced them. When styles shifted, he adapted. He kept the blue notes alive, not with chart success, but with sheer willpower. Through the late 1,950 seconds and into the 1,960 seconds, the lineup rotated endlessly. Every time the group seemed close to a breakthrough, it slipped just out of reach. But Harold refused to quit. He was convinced that if he held the line, if he kept drilling and molding, his moment would come. In those years, Harold's vision carried the group more than any single voice. He wasn't just chasing fame, he was building a blueprint. He wanted an ensemble that could embody discipline and sophistication, a unit capable of matching gospel's raw power with the polish of a new, modern soul. In smoky clubs across Philadelphia, audiences began to notice that even if the Blue Notes weren't yet famous, they were different. They sounded tight, they looked sharp, they carried themselves like professionals. Still, opportunities remained scarce. Recording contracts fizzled. Songs that seemed promising vanished without impact. The dream of a breakthrough began to feel like a mirage. But Harold's resilience was ironclad. He believed perhaps more than anyone that one day the world would hear the sound he'd been refining in his head. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, after nearly 2 decades of grinding in obscurity, Harold had become known in North Philly circles as the city's best-kept secret. He had endured shady deals, countless departures, and the sting of being overlooked again and again, and yet he kept the Blue Notes alive. It was a long, quiet struggle, the kind few people ever saw. But Harold Melvin wasn't waiting for luck. He was waiting for alignment for the missing piece that would finally complete his puzzle. And soon enough, that piece would arrive in the form of a young drummer whose baritone voice could set a stage on fire. By the late 1,960 seconds, the Blue Notes were no longer just a neighborhood doo-wop act chasing the ghost of a hit. Under Harold Melvin's relentless direction, they were becoming something sharper, more polished, more determined. Where many groups of the era simply drifted with the currents of changing styles, Harold was steering with both hands on the wheel. He didn't want to ride the wave of soul music, he wanted to shape it. The transformation wasn't accidental. Harold took the raw foundation of doo-wop they had started with, and began layering it with a deeper sense of musicality. He pushed for harmonies that felt lush but controlled, arrangements that were smoother yet still emotionally potent, and stage presentations that reflected the rising sophistication of the Philadelphia. Every element from the notes sung to the clothes worn was filtered through Harold's vision. He wasn't just a performer anymore. He was a strategist, a manager, a taskmaster. Rehearsals became boot camps. He drilled singers until every harmony was seamless, every movement on stage choreographed with precision. He curated the group's songbook, deciding which numbers would showcase their strengths and which ones could be discarded. He even dictated wardrobe, believing that image was inseparable from sound. To Harold, professionalism wasn't optional, it was survival. The group had already endured too many false starts and near misses. He believed that if they projected excellence in every detail, eventually the world would have no choice but to notice. Around this time, Harold made a bold move that would forever define the group's identity. He put his own name in front, Harold Melvin. Some critics and even fellow musicians called it egotistical. After all, Harold wasn't the lead singer, and the spotlight rarely lingered on him during performances. But Harold didn't see it as vanity, he saw it as branding. To him, it was about permanence. Singers came and went. Lineups shifted constantly. But Harold was the anchor, the constant force. By stamping his name on the marquee, he was cementing the fact that the group was his creation, his vision, his responsibility. It was insurance against anonymity, a declaration that no matter who sang the leads, the architect behind it all would not be forgotten. At least, that was the intention. But putting his name in front didn't guarantee. Through the late 1960 seconds, Harold continued pushing the Blue Notes through recording sessions with small labels, Josie Records, Arctic Records, Checker Records. Each single carried the weight of hope. Each release was a chance at the breakthrough Harold had been chasing for nearly 2 decades. But time after time, the songs failed to ignite beyond the local circuit. They built buzz in Philadelphia, sometimes even spilling into nearby markets, but national traction remained elusive. The disappointment was crushing, but Harold refused to let it destroy the group. Instead, he doubled down on discipline. If the industry wouldn't give them the spotlight, he would make sure they were ready when it came. He held the group to almost impossible standards, demanding military-level precision in harmonies and stagecraft. To many members, it felt suffocating. Some left over creative differences, others because they simply couldn't handle Harold's The revolving door of members became almost dizzying. Faces came and went, sometimes before fans could even learn their names. But Harold was undeterred. If someone walked out, he found a replacement. If a lineup didn't gel, he reshaped it. His perfectionism often bred resentment, but it also preserved the group's identity. No matter who stood beside him, the Blue Notes sounded like the Blue Notes because Harold refused to compromise. There were nights when the group dazzled local crowds, when the harmonies soared and audiences left in awe. But there were also nights when the applause faded quickly, when the sting of yet another failed single lingered. For Harold, those moments were devastating. And yet, he kept going. He believed, perhaps more than anyone else, that their time would come. He could hear it in his head, a sound that wasn't just local or regional but universal. He believed the right combination of voices, discipline, and material could break through. He just hadn't found the final piece yet. By the end of the decade, Harold Melvin had built more than just a group, he had built a brand. He had stamped his name into the very identity of the Blue Notes, molded their sound to reflect his vision, and instilled in them a work ethic that would rival any group in the business. They weren't stars yet, but they were something just as important: ready. The Blue Notes of the late 1960 seconds were a product of Harold's sheer willpower. While other acts flamed out after one hit or dissolved under industry pressures, the Blue Notes endured. They survived not because of chart success, but because Harold refused to let them die. He had kept them alive through sheer grit, reshaping them again and again, determined that one day the world would finally hear what he heard. What Harold didn't know then was that his persistence was about to be rewarded. After years of false starts, countless disappointments, and endless lineup changes, he was on the brink of discovering the missing piece to his puzzle. A young drummer was about to step into his orbit, someone with a voice so powerful, so magnetic, that it could carry heartbreak and revolution in a single note. And when Harold recognized that voice, everything would change. In 1970, after nearly 2 decades of grinding in obscurity, Harold Melvin's persistence finally collided with destiny. A young man named Theodore Teddy Pendergrass walked into Harold's orbit not as a star, not even as a singer, but as a drummer. At just 20 years old, Teddy was tall, confident, and carried himself with the kind of presence that turned heads the moment he entered a room. But to Harold, he was simply part of the rhythm section, another cog in the machine he had been keeping alive since the 1950 seconds. That perception changed the first time Harold heard Teddy's voice. It was raw. It was thunderous. It was velvet wrapped in fire, a sound that could carry heartbreak, defiance, and desire all at once. For Harold, who had spent years shaping voices, arranging harmonies, and searching for the missing element, it was like hearing lightning in human form. He stopped cold, recognizing instantly what others might have missed. This was no ordinary baritone. This was a once-in-a-generation gift. Harold had always seen himself as the architect of the Blue Notes. He built the structure, enforced the discipline, and created the blueprint. But in Teddy Pendergrass, he saw the perfect instrument to bring that architecture to life. Without hesitation, Harold made one of the boldest decisions of his career. He stepped back from the microphone and pushed Teddy forward. It was not for a man who had fought so long to put his own name in front of the group. who had sacrificed his youth to keep the Blue Notes alive, ceding the spotlight could have been unthinkable. But Harold wasn't blinded by ego, he was driven by vision. He understood that Teddy's voice could do what no lineup change, no rehearsal, no small label single had ever accomplished. It could break them through. The transition was swift. One night, Teddy was keeping time on the drums. The next, he was standing at center stage, commanding audiences with a vocal presence that felt both primal and refined. And under Harold's leadership, the group began to evolve around him. Arrangements were tailored to showcase Teddy's rasping power. Harmonies were adjusted to complement his range, and stage shows were redesigned so that when Teddy sang, all eyes were locked on him. Behind the scenes, Harold continued to he drilled the group harder than ever, ensuring that Teddy's explosive voice was supported by airtight harmonies and disciplined performances. But for the first time, Harold wasn't the face of the brand. He was the architect in the wings, shaping the sound while someone else carried it into the spotlight. The gamble paid off almost immediately. Crowds that had once offered polite applause now roared with excitement. Promoters who had overlooked the Blue Notes for years began to take notice. And most importantly, the timing aligned perfectly with a new wave rising in Philadelphia. The orchestrated, polished, emotionally charged soul music being crafted by producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. For Harold, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He had kept the Blue Notes alive through sheer willpower, convinced that one day the right voice would come along to elevate his vision. Now, with Teddy Pendergrass at the mic, and with it, the stage was set for Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes to finally step out of the shadows and into history. As Teddy Pendergrass stepped to the microphone, another crucial piece of the puzzle was falling into place. In the early 1970 seconds, Philadelphia International Records, founded by Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, was on the rise. Their vision was bold, to craft a new sound of soul, one drenched in orchestration, sophistication, and they needed groups who could embody that polished energy. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, under Harold's iron discipline and now powered by Teddy's searing voice, fit the bill perfectly. In 1972, the partnership became official. Harold signed the group to Philadelphia International, finally securing the kind of backing he had dreamed of since the 1950 seconds. The gamble he had taken moving Teddy from the drum kit to the center stage was about to pay off in ways he could never have imagined. The breakthrough came almost instantly. If You Don't Know Me By Now was released in 1972, and from the opening notes, it was clear this was not just another R&B ballad. It was tender yet devastating, elegant yet aching. Teddy's voice carried every ounce of heartbreak, while Harold's carefully arranged harmonies wrapped around him like velvet. The single shot to #1 on the Billboard R&B chart and #3 on the Hot 100, giving Harold and the Blue Notes their first true national success. But with triumph came irony. Many audiences assumed that the commanding baritone belonged to Harold Melvin himself. After all, it was his name on the marquee. Harold, ever the strategist, didn't correct them loudly. Why would he? He had built the machine, crafted the image. If the public wanted to believe he was the voice, then in a way his branding had worked. Teddy might have been the engine, but Harold remained the architect. The hits didn't stop there. In 1973, they released The Love I Lost, a heartbreak anthem set to a pulsing disco groove. It soared to #1 R&B and #7 pop, and many historians now credit it as one of the first true disco records. The group wasn't just following trends, they were shaping them. Then came 1975's Wake Up Everybody, a socially conscious anthem that called listeners to action in a troubled world. Unlike their romantic ballads, this track was a plea for unity and responsibility, proof that Harold's group could balance tenderness with political weight. Supported by Gamble and Huff's shimmering production, the song became a cultural moment, echoing through rallies, community meetings, and living rooms across America. During these years, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes were unstoppable. Every release climbed the charts. Every performance dazzled. Backed by Gamble and Huff's lush arrangements and driven by Teddy's once-in-a-generation voice, the group embodied the sophistication of Philadelphia soul. They were smooth yet powerful, romantic yet socially engaged, glamorous yet grounded. For Harold, It seemed like vindication. 2 decades of grinding in obscurity, endless lineup changes, and countless disappointments had led to this. The group he had built, reshaped, and branded was finally at the pinnacle of the industry. He had created a platform that introduced the world to Teddy Pendergrass and defined the sound of a city. But even in the glow of success, shadows lingered. Harold had learned long ago that when you hand someone the microphone, you don't always control where the spotlight falls. And as Teddy's star power grew brighter, the balance of power within the group began to shift. For now, though, the glory was undeniable. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes had become one of the most important soul groups of the 1970 seconds. Their songs were not just hits, they were milestones. And Harold, the man behind it all, finally had proof that his vision had been right all along. By 1974, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes were everywhere. Their records dominated radio playlists, their faces appeared on television, and their concerts packed halls to the rafters. Songs like "The Love I Lost" weren't just chart successes, they became cultural moments, spinning endlessly at roller rinks and nightclubs. Meanwhile, "Wake Up Everybody" resonated beyond entertainment, echoing in church basements, rallies, and community meetings as a call to social awareness. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The group appeared to be at the peak of its powers, a polished unit embodying the very essence of Philadelphia soul. Backed by Gamble and Huff's masterful production and propelled by Teddy Pendergrass's explosive vocals, they seemed unstoppable. They graced Soul Train, shared stages with Motown royalty, and headlined venues that only a decade earlier had been closed to black performers. Yet inside this whirlwind of success, new tensions began to emerge. The adoring crowds weren't shouting Harold's name, they were chanting Teddy's. While Harold had worked tirelessly to brand himself as the group's architect, the public increasingly saw Teddy as its true star. His tall frame, smoldering charisma, and raw baritone turned him into a sex symbol, the kind of frontman who left women screaming and promoters begging for more shows. For Harold, the irony was painful. He had named the group after himself, carried it through 2 decades of rejection, shaped its sound, arranged its vocals, and negotiated its deals. He saw himself as the mastermind, the CEO of the enterprise. Yet the spotlight, the magazine features, and the fan adoration were all aimed at the man he had elevated. The media only deepened the divide. Profiles praised Teddy's swagger, his style, his unmatched stage presence. Fans wanted to know him, to see him, to hear him. The fact that the group still bore Harold's name seemed almost irrelevant. Slowly but surely, Teddy Pendergrass was becoming the face of the Blue Notes in every sense. Behind the scenes, resentment simmered. Sources close to the group recalled disagreements between Harold and Teddy over creative direction, stage arrangements, and above all, money. As founder and manager, Harold controlled the finances. He had structured the group's pay in a way that reflected his view of its hierarchy, but not Teddy's new reality as the undeniable frontman. Despite being the centerpiece of their success, Teddy felt underpaid, undervalued, and he wasn't afraid to say it. Rumors spread that Harold was shortchanging his own band, refusing to renegotiate terms even as their star power soared. Shouting matches erupted backstage, tempers flared, and fault lines deepened. To outsiders, the group remained flawless on stage, tight harmonies, elegant choreography, and commanding performances. But offstage, the brotherhood was unraveling. It was a classic story in music history, the visionary who built the stage versus the star who stole the show. And for Harold Melvin, the cost of success was becoming clear. He had finally brought his vision to life, only to find himself being eclipsed by the very talent he had discovered. By 1975, the tension inside Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes was impossible to hide. On stage, they remained a picture of perfection. Teddy Pendergrass commanded the mic with authority, the harmonies were airtight, and the choreography was crisp. To the audience, they looked invincible. But behind the curtain, fault lines were splitting wide open. What had started as creative friction had grown into a full-scale battle for control, recognition, and Harold still saw himself as the architect, the man who had built the group from the ground up, carried it through decades of obscurity, and shaped the very sound that was now topping charts. To him, Teddy was the instrument, the engine of a machine that Harold had designed. But to Teddy, the reality was different. He was the one the crowds came to see. He was the one magazines wrote about. He was the one who made women scream in packed arenas. Money only made matters. As founder and manager, Harold controlled the finances, and his system of pay did not reflect Teddy's elevated status as frontman. Despite being the centerpiece of their success, Teddy felt he wasn't receiving what he deserved. He believed he was the star, and stars demanded star treatment. Harold, stubborn and uncompromising, refused to bend. Rumors swirled that Harold was shortchanging his band, pocketing more than his share, and refusing to renegotiate deals even as the group's fame skyrocketed. Neither Harold nor Teddy ever confirmed these stories publicly, but those close to the group described heated arguments and shouting matches backstage. It wasn't just about money, it was about identity, about who truly represented the Blue Notes. The dynamic had become unsustainable. Harold refused to let go of the reins. Teddy refused to remain in the background. Each man dug in his heels, unwilling to compromise, and the group became caught in a tug-of-war between its creator and its star. The irony was cruel. Harold had dreamed of this moment for nearly 20 years, only to discover that success threatened to tear everything apart. By mid-1975, the writing was on the wall. The tension had reached a breaking point. Audiences still saw flawless performances, but what once felt like unity now felt like survival. Each show both a triumph and a reminder that the end was near. And then, the inevitable happened. Teddy Pendergrass, lured by the promise of a solo deal from Philadelphia International Records, and emboldened by the whispers of industry insiders, decided to leave. For the fans, it seemed sudden, even shocking. But for those who had witnessed the turmoil behind the scenes, it was only a matter of time. The split marked the end. Teddy would go on to become a solo superstar, while Harold faced the unthinkable. The group he had carried on his back for decades was about to lose the very voice that had finally brought it fame. The architect had built his cathedral, but the brightest light inside it was walking out the door. When Teddy Pendergrass finally walked away in 1975, it felt like a thunderclap. For fans, it was abrupt, even shocking. But for those who had followed the group closely, the signs had been there for months: financial disputes, creative disagreements, egos colliding. The inevitable had happened. The voice that carried Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes into the spotlight was gone. For Teddy, the leap was a triumph. With the full backing of Gamble and Huff, he launched into a solo career that would make him one of the most iconic soul singers of his. For Harold, however, Teddy's departure marked the beginning of a long, painful descent. Yet in true Harold fashion, he refused to fold. The group was his creation, his life's work, and he wasn't about to let it die. He moved quickly to restructure the lineup, bringing in David Ebo as the new lead vocalist. Ebo had talent, there was no doubt about that, but replacing Teddy was an impossible task. Fans who had been drawn to the group by Teddy's volcanic presence now struggled to connect with a new voice at the front. Still, Harold pressed on, determined to prove that the Blue Notes were more than one man. In 1977, the group released Reaching for the World, their first post-Teddy album. The record carried Harold's fingerprints, tight harmonies, lush arrangements, the disciplined precision that had defined the Blue Notes for decades. But the public reception was lukewarm. The momentum that had propelled them to the top just a few years earlier was gone. Later that same year, they released Now Is the Time, but again, the impact was minimal. Without Teddy, the spark had dimmed. It wasn't for lack of effort. Harold pushed the group relentlessly through the late 1970 seconds, booking tours, recording sessions, and television appearances. He drilled them with the same perfectionism that had once forged them into a powerhouse, but the industry had moved on. The smooth, orchestrated sound of Philadelphia soul, once the pinnacle of sophistication, was beginning to feel dated. Audiences were shifting toward disco, then funk, and soon the emerging pulse of hip-hop. The sound Harold had helped to pioneer was now being labeled as old-fashioned. Still, Harold refused to give up. He believed in the essence of the Blue Notes, believed that if he kept the machine running, success might circle back. They continued to tour, sometimes to enthusiastic crowds, sometimes to half-empty venues. In each performance, Harold demanded excellence, as if sheer discipline could will the group back into relevance. But the reality was undeniable. Without Teddy's voice, the group could not command the same attention. Critics dismissed the new lineup as a pale imitation of its former self. Promoters booked them for smaller halls. Radio stations stopped giving them the kind of rotation they once enjoyed. Harold had fought too hard to let the Blue Notes disappear, but holding the line came at a cost. He was working harder than ever for diminishing returns. The contrast was cruel. While Teddy soared as a solo act, climbing the charts and filling arenas, Harold struggled to keep his group afloat. The man who had discovered Teddy, who had sacrificed his own spotlight to put him at the front, was now left behind, watching as the voice he unleashed. Through it all, Harold clung to the identity he had built. The Blue Notes were his, and he would not abandon them. Even as the hits dried up and the crowds thinned, he kept the wheels turning. To him, it wasn't about chasing glory anymore. It was about survival, about keeping alive the brand and the sound he had devoted his life to. By the end of the 1,970 seconds, it was clear that the magic of the Gamble and Huff years could not be recaptured. Harold Melvin had rebuilt the stage, but without the engine that once powered it, the machine could never roar the same way again. Part 6b, Finances, Health, and Silence, is approximately equal to 640 words. The 1,980 seconds were unkind to Harold Melvin. Without Teddy Pendergrass's magnetic presence, the Blue Notes had lost their commercial spark. The hits had dried up, and while Harold kept grinding booking shows, cutting records, pushing the group forward, the momentum was gone. What remained was the shell of an empire he had once fought so hard to build. Financial problems soon followed. Royalties from the glory days were slim, and with no new chart toppers to replenish the coffers, income dwindled. Harold struggled to manage his business affairs, and reports suggest that money was often tight. He performed when he could, accepting modest bookings, sometimes in small clubs, sometimes overseas, sometimes to crowds who barely remembered the group's. The lavish stages of the Apollo Theater or the glamour of Soul Train were long behind him. Meanwhile, Teddy Pendergrass was scaling the heights as a solo act. Even after his tragic 1982 car accident that left him paralyzed from the chest down, Teddy remained a towering figure in R&B. His solo albums continued to chart, his resilience inspiring fans worldwide. Harold, by contrast, seemed stuck in the past, an innovator of a sound now considered a relic, a man watching from the sidelines as others reaped the rewards of the style he helped shape. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. Harold had discovered Teddy, nurtured him, and placed him in the spotlight. Yet now he watched as Teddy's name was etched in the annals of soul history, while his own faded into the margins. Harold never received the glossy magazine profiles, the comeback features, or the accolades that his peers enjoyed. No Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, no Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, no biopic to cement his place. As the 1,980 seconds gave way to the 1,990 seconds, Harold's health began to fail. A series of strokes struck him down, one after another, robbing him of his ability to perform, to travel, even to speak publicly. For a man whose very identity was wrapped in leadership, in controlling harmonies and commanding the stage, the decline was devastating. His once commanding presence grew quiet. His voice, once full of authority, was silenced. By the early 1,990 seconds, Harold Melvin was no longer a fixture on stage, but a shadow of the visionary who had built the Blue Notes. While others enjoyed late-career revivals or celebrated tributes, Harold endured his battle privately, mostly forgotten by the industry he had helped define. There were no grand tours in his final years, no national television appearances, no honorary awards. Just small shows when his health allowed, a dwindling audience, and the quiet erosion of the recognition he deserved. On the 24th of March 1997, Harold Melvin passed away from complications of a stroke. He was only 57 years old. The news barely made headlines. There were no sold-out memorials, no televised tributes, no thunderous send-off befitting a man who had crafted songs that defined an era. His death came quietly, almost as if the industry had decided to look the other way. For the man who had discovered one of the greatest soul voices of the 20th century, who had built the blueprint for Philadelphia soul, who had kept a group alive through sheer force of will, the final chapter was heartbreakingly Harold Melvin had built the machine but never stood fully in its glow. In the end, the silence that greeted his passing reflected the silence that had haunted much of his career. The architect remained in the shadows while others basked in the spotlight. When the history of soul music is told, certain names dominate the conversation. Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin, Curtis Mayfield, Teddy Pendergrass. But beneath those towering legends, for Philadelphia soul, that foundation was Harold Melvin. Harold and the Blue Notes were more than just another R&B group. They were a blueprint. Their fusion of raw gospel emotion, precise vocal harmonies, and lush orchestration created a template that reshaped 1,970 soul. Guided by Harold's relentless discipline and Gamble and Huff's production genius, the Blue Notes bridged. They could deliver a tender love ballad like If You Don't Know Me By Now with aching vulnerability, and then pivot to a socially charged anthem like Wake Up Everybody without losing cohesion. This versatility became one of the defining hallmarks of Philadelphia soul. Even after Harold faded from the charts, his influence lived on. R&B artists throughout the 1,980 seconds, 1,990 seconds, and 2,000 seconds drew from. You can hear the echoes of Harold's blueprint in the smooth vocal stylings of Mary J. Blige, the polished showmanship of Usher, the heartfelt delivery of Alicia Keys, and the soaring harmonies of Boyz II Men. These artists may not always invoke Harold's name, but his fingerprints are on their music. The impact wasn't limited to singers. Producers and beatmakers in the golden age of hip-hop dug deep into crates of vinyl searching for sounds with weight, warmth, and emotion. They found a goldmine in Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. Tracks like Bad Luck and You Know How to Make Me Feel So Good became raw material for a new generation of musicians armed with drum machines and MPCs. The horns, the grooves, the emotional textures all carried Harold's sonic DNA into hip-hop. Jay-Z sampled them. Ludacris sampled them. Fat Joe sampled them. Common sampled them. Behind the bars and beats of these rappers lay Harold's architecture, reintroduced to young audiences who often had no idea who Harold Melvin was. The irony was striking. The man who had once struggled for recognition in his own time was now woven into the fabric of songs that filled clubs and radio stations decades later. His name might not have been in the credits of every casual listener's memory, but his sound endured. That endurance is the true. Awards and headlines fade. Fame is fickle, but influence real. Influence ripples forward long after the spotlight dims. Harold didn't just make records. He made building blocks. He sculpted a sound that others stood on, borrowed from, and carried into new eras. Even in the absence of mainstream recognition, his contributions remain undeniable. Every time a ballad drips with sincerity, every time harmonies glide over orchestration with elegance, every time a hip-hop producer flips a soulful groove into something modern, Harold Melvin's presence is felt. He may not have gotten the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction or the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. He may not be name-dropped in every conversation about 1,970 soul, but he shaped the texture of modern black music in ways that are both subtle and. He was a builder of sound, a sculptor of feeling, a quiet architect whose work continues to stand even if his name does not. In the story of Philadelphia soul, Harold Melvin was the blueprint. And blueprints don't fade, they endure, guiding generations who may never know the name of the man who drew them, but who live inside the world he imagined. For decades, one of the most ironic twists in soul music history persisted. People thought Teddy Pendergrass, the man whose name was emblazoned on every marquee and album cover, was not the one singing the hits that made the group famous. And the man who was singing those songs became so famous that he erased the name that launched him. Harold never corrected the misconception loudly. Perhaps he thought the music spoke for itself. Perhaps he believed that his role as architect would be understood in time. But silence. In an industry that thrives on image and story, Harold's quietness allowed Teddy's legend to eclipse him almost completely. The truth is that the music industry and the public crave faces. They crave a star who can be packaged, sold, and idolized. Teddy had everything: the voice, the charisma, the looks, even the narrative of triumph and tragedy. He was easy to market, and Gamble and Huff knew it. Album covers, tour posters, and media campaigns increasingly focused on Teddy. Interviews were requested with the frontman, not the founder. By the time Teddy launched his solo career, many casual fans didn't even realize Harold Melvin was a real person. To them, the name was simply a banner above Teddy's voice. The cruel irony of Harold's branding decision to put his name in front of the group for permanence was that it backfired. It deepened the confusion. Teddy's star rose, and Harold's identity blurred into the background. Part of the erasure also came from Harold's persona. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't charming in the ways the industry likes to showcase. He was strict, controlling, sometimes difficult. He made executive decisions, demanded discipline, and carried himself as a businessman more than an entertainer. The industry rarely celebrates black men in that role, especially when their contributions can't be condensed into a soundbite or a voice on the... Worse still, Harold never had a solo breakthrough, never enjoyed a comeback narrative to rewrite his story. Without a counterbalance, the myth stuck. Teddy was the star, and Harold was barely remembered. When Harold died in 1997 at just 57 years old, the headlines were few, the tributes small. No Rock Hall induction, no Grammy Lifetime honor, no thunderous send-off, just silence where there should have been thunder. And yet, listen closely, and Harold's presence is still there. In the horns, the harmonies, the discipline, the emotional scaffolding of every Blue Notes track, his fingerprints remain. He may have been overlooked by history books, but not by the music itself. The spotlight fades, but the architecture endures. Harold Melvin's life is a case study in the price of leadership without fame. He built the stage, but he never stood at its center. He shaped voices, but rarely raised his own. He constructed a sound that influenced generations, yet he slipped into the shadows of the very machine he created. In the end, Harold wasn't the voice you heard on the radio. He wasn't the one center stage, drenched in lights. But he was the architect who made it possible. Without Harold, there would be no Teddy Pendergrass as the world knows him. No If You Don't Know Me By Now. No Wake Up Everybody. No blueprint for Philadelphia soul as it exploded onto the global stage. So the question lingers. Should Harold Melvin be remembered alongside the giants of soul, or will he remain an uncredited genius, mistaken for someone else? His name may never headline the halls of fame, but for those who feel the ache in a Blue Notes ballad or the fire in a sampled groove, Harold Melvin lives on. Harold Melvin's story is not one of glittering fame or golden tributes. It is the story of a man who built the machine, who discovered voices, who shaped harmonies, who crafted a sound that defined an era only to die in near silence, overlooked by the very industry he helped shape. From the streets of North Philadelphia to the polished stages of Soul Train, Harold's fingerprints are everywhere. He founded the Blue Notes, molded them with discipline, and had the vision to step aside when he discovered a voice powerful enough to change history. Without Harold, there would be no Teddy Pendergrass as we know him. No If You Don't Know Me By Now, no Wake Up Everybody, no blueprint for Philadelphia soul. And yet, when history is written, his name is too often absent. Fans remember the songs, but not the architect. They chant the voice, but forget the man who placed that voice at the microphone. Harold Melvin was never the superstar. He was the strategist, the perfectionist, the builder of emotion. So, we are left with the question, should Harold Melvin be remembered alongside the giants of soul Marvin Gaye, Curtis Mayfield, Teddy Pendergrass, or will he remain an uncredited genius, mistaken for someone else? In truth, his legacy doesn't live in awards or plaques. It lives in every wedding where a Blue Notes ballad plays, in every protest where their message still resonates, in every hip-hop record sampled from his sound. His name may fade from the marquee, but his music never will. Harold Melvin may not have craved the spotlight, but he created it, and because of that, his light endures.